IVM.
If you look around India and the world, the commons seem to be going to hell. Fishing zones are vanishing, cities are dealing with heavy air pollution, and the world as a whole is dealing with climate change. These are all the commons, and they're all suffering from tragedies. Lingaraj Jayaprakash joins us on the Pragati Podcast today to help us think about local and global commons much better. Welcome to the Pragati Podcast, a weekly talk show on public policy, economics and international relations. I'm your host, Pavan Srinath. Lingaraj Jayaprakash is a researcher at the Sustainable Futures Lab at McGill University, and he's working on environment and development. He's just submitted his doctoral thesis on development and conservation in peri-urban Bangalore at McGill University. We'll start our conversation with Lingaraj after a short break.
Hello and welcome to a brand new and exciting week on IVM. We'd like to give a shout out to our sponsors, Storytel and Paytm Money. On the scene and the unseen, Amit Verma's guest is quizmaster and sports expert Joy Bhattacharya. Joy talks about his journey as a team director for the Kolkata Knight Riders, his role in the Under-17 FIFA World Cup, and the evolution of televised sports in India. On Advertising is Dead, Varun talks to founder and editor of Dead Ant, Ravina Rawal. They talk about Dead Ant as a platform to discuss news and events around comedy. On Ganatantra, Alok and Sarayu are joined by Dr. Carol Sperry to talk about the role of women in electoral politics. On Simplified, Chuck and Nareen are joined by Director Insights of Brandscape Worldwide, Utsav Memoria, for part 2 of how to travel on a Desi budget. On Geek Fruit, Dinkar and Jishnu talk about the highly distinctive director, screenwriter and producer Edgar Wright. On IVM Likes, IVM staffers Abbas, that's me, Darius and Madhuri are discussing the highest IMDb rated series Chernobyl and also delve into the phenomena of grief watching. On the Habit Coach podcast, Ashton talks about the beliefs of bad and good habits and how a habit that is bad for someone can be good for someone else. On our Kannada podcast Thale Harate, Sri Ranjani speaks to Ganesh Chakravarti and Takshashila Institution's Soumya Nandan and her endeavour to revive the interest of ancient board games in India. On Equity Sahi Hai, Srinath Mithanthaya, Senior VP at Motilal Oswal AMC, talks to Anupam about value migration and how it's different from value creation. And with that, let's continue on with your show.
Hi Lingaraj, welcome to the Pragati Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Hi Pavan, thanks for having me.
So Lingaraj, you've been working on commons, you've been working on certain problems around peri-urban Bangalore and other things as well in your thesis. And we see so many problems around us which are commons issues, right? You know, groundwater in most of our cities is either polluted or disappearing. Our roads are congested everywhere. Traffic is a massive problem. You have air pollution in Delhi, in Bangalore, in Shanghai. And you have sort of carbon pollution, if you will, and, you know, excessive carbon dioxide in the world's atmosphere. So all of us are dealing with climate change. And all of these, and perhaps many more such examples, come down to this idea of the commons, right? That there's something common to all of us that's not being protected, that's being ruined in some way or the other. So we thought we'll spend this podcast talking about the commons and the various ideas people have had on this. So could you start us off? How did academics and economists and others initially start thinking about the problem of the commons?
I think people have been thinking about it for a long time now. And people have been thinking about it even without, framing it like a commons problem. So much of the work began with, evolutionary biologist Garrett Hardin, who published this sort of a pamphlet of sorts in Science 50 years ago. It was quite provocative and it was titled The Tragedy of Commons. And essentially he is speaking of this pasture, and it's a parable of sorts.
Right.
And you have this set of farmers, these grazers, and it's open access. People can come graze. And for him, every farmer or every grazer that's there is adding sheep to his flock with this intent of maximizing his personal gain. And over time, as it turns out, is that the pasture is ruined and all of socially it's not an optimal situation to be. And
So it makes sense for people, if there are, say, 100 grazers, for them to only graze a certain amount, such that the pasture continues being green and keeps growing back and so on.
So that's
right?
how it should ideally be.
Right. But everyone wants to do one extra and, maximize how
all
much
of
grazing
us,
they themselves want
all
to
of
do.
us are self-centered animals, right? And we're acting to maximize certain goals that are optimal at our level. And that's what he felt was happening. And essentially was using it to think about the population problem and global population problem, and especially in the third world, as they called it. And population bomb, Paul Ehrlich's book had come, and all of them happened simultaneously. And these set of ideas sort of coexisted, and they tended to look at it from a very Malthusian sort of perspective, where resources are not really growing, but then population is growing. That could lead to a whole lot of other things. And then it became very provocative, and science, I think it's still one of the largest, one of the highest cited papers, even to this day.
And tragedy of the commons is something that's become like a popular phrase that people just throw about, right?
Right, about everything practically. And then, so there was a response that people try to articulate, and one of the early responses, and they framed this as a collective action problem. So when I say collective action problem, it's essentially a problem where a group of individuals, that demands a group of individuals to come together and work. And there are things that wouldn't let them do the way they should, right? So one of the most articulate and a powerful sort of response was by Elinor Ostrom, who was the first female to win the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2009, I think.
And also perhaps the first political scientist to win the Nobel Prize in Economics.
A lot of mainstream...
Absolutely.
A lot of mainstream economists were kind of shocked that she's not an economist itself. But I think inadvertently she was one of the progenitors of this whole field of economics called the institutional economics. So what Ostrom posited was...
So before that, what does Garrett Hardin even posit? So you have this tragedy of the commons. Right. So you have, so basically if he posits that if left unchecked, the grazers will overgraze and there might also be pollution, right? No one will maintain the space very well. So, and we see
pollution
that,
and depletion of the resources. To use his phrase, he'll say ruin of all. Tragedy of common leads to everybody's ruin. Right? So, and his solutions are just twofold. You need a strong state and you need to privatize.
Okay.
In the absence of which, it would lead to this thing. So that was as very simplistic.
So you build fences, you parcel the pasture land and say, okay, you get this much.
Right.
So because I own that much, I am going to ensure that it is okay and I don't overgraze it.
Right.
That's his idea, right?
And so Elinor Ostrom stepped in, and I think one of her early roots, so as to say, of her ideas was looking at the Swiss meadow, where essentially people have been grazing for a long, long time, and people have been grazing responsibly, and there were things that made that possible, right? The pasture was still a very thriving, productive ecosystem, so as to say. So what she observed was there's this 15th century law which said that you can't own, which was codified by the community itself, you can't own more sheep than the number of sheep that you would own in winters.
Okay.
Because in winter, you can't rely on the public land. You'll have to rely on your own sort of, the hay and the grass that you have saved. Right? That you've planned for, that you need to pay. It's your investment. So you can't do that in spring and in summer. So that had ensured that people don't transgress and the tragedy hadn't hit that particular pasture. And then she said, this whole tragedy of commons is a very simplistic way of understanding human behavior and how they interact with resources. People have a way of coming together. People have been doing that for a long time. There are these examples from world over, and people tend to self-organize and act altruistically, thinking from not just from a very personal utility maximization point of view, but also from a social utility in that sense. And then she started generating this very rich body of work, mostly from South Asia, Nepal, India, not so much in India, but a lot of work in Nepal, and then other parts of the world, Latin America, Africa, and then that became her personal passion, trying to find and trying to build this whole theory of how people resolve collective action problems.
So in a nutshell, there are collective action problems of all kinds, right? I mean, they're like a bigger set than just sort of commons related issues, right? I mean, from how we elect our government to how, the entire democratic process can be looked at as a collective action thing.
Right.
But at the core of it, what was the Ostromian sort of idea of how you govern the commons? How do you bring about collective action for the commons?
Right. So, drawing from the Swiss example that I gave, and I think she also drew ideas from some of the work that was already happening. This economist called Douglas North, it already started thinking about institutions. So she said people have a way to devise rules, and she called this as institutions.
Okay.
People have a way to devise these rules to reduce transaction costs. That's what she said. Transaction costs, or any cost, anything that we accrue while dealing with each other, or while we are dealing with a system or with any resource base, right? So people have a way of devising these rules, and it can happen through community action. It can happen through deliberation. It can happen through sanctions. And then she started mapping how they do it, and in various contexts. And she started building this empirical research program across the world. And then they started conceptualizing these minor things like, when does collaboration come? What are those conditions that lead to collaboration? How can we think of responding? How can we devise these rule mechanisms? How can we tap into? People have a certain creative approach towards solving their own problems, right? How can we tap into that? So most of her work was in articulating this vision of self-governance, and I think that was quite a powerful vision at that time. And I think it's one of the most influential ones even to this day, because there's a lot of policy programs that have borrowed some of these ideas and have either as a way to validate some of the things that they were planning, or as a way to drive a certain agenda. And
so here, like in the Swiss example that you gave, it's not so much that there was a strong government which put that law and enforced it, but that the community sort of had come up with that law.
Right.
And it was more like a community agreement that got codified into law, but more that it was a community arrangement that we will do only this.
Right.
So in that sense, Ostrom goes beyond the idea of the government or the state and the market.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's the core of her research agenda.
Right.
That states and market can function. Of course, they are the most vital institutions that we have, but there are other rule regimes that operate and that mediate human action and behavior, and that are pretty vital to the challenge of dealing with most of our social problems.
And these could be religious, traditional, community-based, anything.
Absolutely, caste networks.
Right.
Everything. I mean, there's an intricate set of rules, right? Do's, don'ts, and there are sanctions. A whole lot of mechanisms that are devised to help people deal or rather make people act in a certain way.
Right.
And all of that are institutions. So institutions for her were rules of the game, and in a very broadly defined sense, that all of us know how to act. Nobody tells us how to act. For instance, if you've traveled anywhere in the Himalayas, and if you're driving and you're driving uphill and there's a vehicle coming downhill, nobody has written it anywhere, but right of way is always to the vehicle that's coming up, driving towards the summit, right? And that's devised by the people themselves, by the drivers themselves, and over time it's become a norm, and nobody has gone there and told them how to act, how to behave, but it's something that's producing an outcome that's important in that context, right? It's helping them navigate that rough terrain that they have. And these sort of things. And there are examples.
And there's a societal benefit that comes from this sort of norm being in place.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Lower accidents, less getting stuck in bad places.
Right. And it's also transfused quite efficiently. nobody goes around telling people that this is there. It's become a norm that because people are doing it repeatedly, right? That becomes another part of her conceptualization. Through repeated interactions, these rules are formalized. These rules are made better in that sense. There's even these rules are changing over time because the conditions around it are also changing.
So, could we look at that as like a iterated prisoner's dilemma?
Absolutely.
Right. So you have your two prisoners. Right. You rat out the other person. You do better.
Right.
But if you cooperate, you both walk off all right. And this usually happens only when you have to play that game again and again and again. Right.
But here, in this case, it's not the same individual that's doing it. Here, it's a member of the community that's doing it.
Right.
And that knowledge is also getting transfused and transmitted across spaces.
So, in that sense, is there also sort of social pressure to conform to that norm in a certain way? That if you're someone, who is coming downhill and takes right away, you're considered an ass, right? Or you're considered selfish,
right?
And not just frown down upon
and
you.
Not just by the driver that's driving uphill, but even by others around him,
right?
And he might get even scolded by the onlookers.
This is sort of the opposite of how, say, traffic in Bangalore or some other city works, right? If you're the guy who is actually waiting for the red signal and actually stopping,
right?
And there are these 5 cars or 5 scooters that just whiz past, you feel like the idiot, not the rule breaker, right? So that's the unfortunate problem where
it's a different normative framework that's operating here,
which is not helping in maintaining the commons,
right?
It's actually actively hurting, maintaining.
Maybe we need to play this game quite a bit more to evolve that sort of an optimal rule framework,
right?
Where all of us understand that it's not good to be doing that. It's not good to change lanes. We're causing congestion, and I think that would take more time.
Yeah, but again, there's a difference in the community of, say, people who live in the hills,
right,
and the communities that make up, say, a large cosmopolitan city, right? And that those kinds of things get factored in.
And I think Ostrom also realized that. So she gave this set of design principles when you're looking at institutions. And one of the things was to look at size of the community. After a point, there are overheads that will bring down the entire system, right? So you need a very loosely defined community that's also very closely aligned with the resource base around it. So which is how you ensure that there are rule conformity, which is how you ensure that there are disincentives and there is also sanctions around transgressing some of those rules. So that was another factor, and that's perhaps why we might not have a similar, intervention possible with traffic.
Right.
So maybe we need an alternate approach, and I think which she also factored in that these institutions or these rule regimes coexist with formal regimes. So she sort of looks at institutions according to 3 tiers. Formal, which is all the institutions are these organizations, right? That's the meaning that we've come to know. But they're also beyond that. Any rule regime, any rule network is an institution. So what she said was that we need to ensure that these informal things, the creative potential of the community, is aligned with a lot of formal interventions that are being planned. So towards the second half of her career, starting from the 90s, she increasingly worked on finding ways to harmonize the formal regulations and the informal mechanisms. How do we ensure that they align with each other, and how do we ensure that there are workable arrangements that come out of this sort of an equation between the formal and the informal, and that's when we can offset some of these challenges.
So let's maybe take an example or something, right? I'm open to say there's a lake in peri-urban Bangalore. These are some of the things you've studied, right? So you have any lake at the edge of any city,
right,
in India faces roughly the same kind of challenges, right? It would have had a historical use of water, which would have been maybe irrigation, maybe some drinking, something. Now those uses are gone, and everyone wants land, so there's encroachment everywhere. And along with that, there's maybe dumping, pollution, and maybe just disappearing of the entire water, right? So this is sort of what's happening in most places in one way or the other. So how would Ostrom come and examine something like this?
In fact, she's done some work in Bangalore in Kaikondrelli Lake.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. There's one paper with Harini Nagendra, who's then at IIT, I think. There's one small work towards the end of her career. And I think that's where we can clearly see the limits of institutional.
Sure. But let's explore this fully first, and then we'll come to the limits.
Okay.
How would she have looked at this?
So one of the ways that they've done is to find newer ways of engaging with that resource. So, of course, you're not drawing water from the lake and irrigating your fields, or you're not drawing water or washing your clothes in the lake. But lake also represents other things, right? Lake is a source of aesthetic enjoyment. Lake is a source of, there's a cultural connection with water. We worship Ganga and all that. So one of the things that they did was to revitalize some of those connections. So they started this Kere Habba and children go there, they play. There's this Walkers Association. And I think all it takes is certain,
and community ownership. Right?
I mean, it's still owned by the Lake Development Authority, but in a formal way. But at the same time, I think communities increasingly got a say in how things operate and work there. And
one of the mechanisms I think in Bangalore they developed was this idea that if you form a local trust, the government or the Lake Development Authority can sort of make you the steward of that.
In the sense, they've relegated these operational level things. So even for Ostrom, rules were not this monolith. So she looks at rules at 3 levels: constitutional level, which is all the codified things; collective action level, and then there are these operational level things.
Right.
So here in Kaikondrelli, this Karyaba was a wonderful initiative, and I think it's still there and it's doing remarkably well. It helps build these newer connections and these forge connections, not just with the resource base, but also with people around it.
Right.
Find a set of stewards, so as to say, and that I think was a very insightful, program.
So it's sort of reconnection to the commons in a sense,
right?
Where you're sort of saying that because people felt disconnected from this lake that was in their neighborhood, there was apathy and nobody cared, and you sort of by default sanctioned all kinds of activities to happen there. But because you've rekindled that connection in a certain way, people have more of a stake. Right.
There's a void of sorts, right? There are these multiple authorities working together. Forest Department, Lake Development Authority, BBMP, BDA, all of them are these multiple authorities that literally have various degrees of jurisdiction over that lake.
And fractured mandates and all that.
And all of that. But at the same time, if you look at the intersection of all of that, this lake, there's a sort of vacuum, there's a sort of void out there. And none of the rules are operating, and it leads to a whole lot of other illicit activities and dumping, waste, etc., etc. And the minute there's some attention there, and the minute you have community coming there and finding meaning and connection, there's already that void is already getting filled in a certain way.
And there's a higher barrier to do illegal things.
Absolutely. And then because of all the benefits that we have through our social media, etc., you can amplify these things. And so then the community is not just the community that's there, but it's also a community that's appreciating it. It's also the community that's elsewhere, but find joy and meaning in engaging with that lake, right? And then that's how we build these coalitions and advocacy groups that can help make our cause. So there's this cascading networks that happen, and all of that will help make your cause. So it's about building these connections around you, building connections with the resource base, and also ensuring that these things have a cross linkages with other similar players elsewhere.
So that was a capsule of how Ostrom might have thought of such a problem.
Right.
But where does that thinking run into limitations?
Right.
In such an example or in anything else?
Even in such an example, if I can say, if you look at Bangalore and the kind of rapid urbanization that's seen, if you want to find ways to intervene in such a situation, there is no way but to think of strong state. I mean, no matter what we do, we can't necessarily fill the void that's left by the state and the inefficiencies that are around it, right? Because of the rapidness of these changes and So we need an iron fist there. We need a strong enforcement mechanisms. Some of those things which are not really palatable. I mean, self-organization is wonderful. It's good. And it's always nice. And at the same time, it has its own limits. And so there's a tendency to focus on these micro situations, to look at collaboration, to look at conceptualizing collaboration, conceptualizing participation, and all of those things in the mainstream Ostromian sense of the term. But when things around you, when the context where you're dealing with is marred by such strong structural changes, be it capitalism, be it the inflow of real estate, money, things that are happening elsewhere, globalization.
And also flux in terms of people, right?
Absolutely.
So if you're talking about a community that's cohesive, that cares about this, and if you have a turnover where 30% of the population changes every 2 years.
But I think you can still find a way to negotiate that aspect. But what I find it difficult is to deal with some of these larger structural things. So where every piece of land is nothing more than a piece of real estate, right? I mean, that's the kind of paradigm that we have, and that's the kind of paradigm that's overriding practically every other concern in the city. And we have a real estate developer who was the Bangalore urban minister. That's the kind of worldview that we are coming with. And when we look at the small lake, and when we start conceptualizing this lake, no matter what we do, it doesn't necessarily fill the void that's happening around us. So,
and doesn't counter the paradigm that land and real estate are paramount.
Right. And even the polity, where that's looking at it as a way to augment revenue or as a way to, help political functionaries get greater say, it's very difficult. And which is something that's increasingly, being countered in the literature. So there's a newer sort of articulation of it. It's called critical institutionalism. So the critical institutionalists question some of these core framings. So they say that, of course, people act keeping in mind of the community, etc. But people are also complicated creatures. They're part of many things. And social interaction is a very nebulous affair, right? There's a lot of intricate things that are happening, all of it simultaneously. And these, for instance, if there is a caste group that's mediating a certain resource use behavior, say, don't harvest this tree in this time because it's sacred, etc. But there's a lot of baggage that comes with those caste groups.
Right.
These networks haven't been designed to just manage this resource. It's a social engagement.
Yeah, they've been designed for something else.
Something else where this is just a part of it. Institutions are a part of social arrangements and not the other way around.
Right.
And so people started articulating, and then there are winners and losers, right? That's the most troubling aspect of this whole institutional arrangement. Just because there's conformity, you go to some village in Rajasthan and there's a water body and people are taking it, using it responsibly. There's an intricate network of rules that is governing their action, and all by the creativity of the community itself. At the same time, who is driving the agenda? What's making them behave the way they are is perhaps the caste relations that are there. So there's upper caste landowning groups that might still have their say, and they'll be driving their things, and so it will trap people in the hierarchy. It will leave winners and it will leave losers there.
So basically, while the commons might be surviving and managing, I mean, there are people who are higher up the pecking order and people who are made sure that they're lower down in the pecking order.
And resource use is not equitable, right?
Right.
Because for Ostrom, the very presence of these rules is a sign of great success. Is a sign of great social, outcome. And it's a way to ensure that there's self-governance. People are participating. That's the notion that they have. So effectively, community ownership of some of these resource systems could in practice just mean that it's owned by upper caste, landowning, male members of...
rather than it being equitable and so on.
Right. People start questioning some of those constructs and how people act, and this sort of unequal playing field that the community has. Community is not a monolith. So that's one of the pitfalls that was there. Community is a very complicated, nebulous sort of an entity, and people are dealing with a lot of things. And the minute we look at these entities as monoliths, we are subsuming a lot of inefficiencies underneath that community thing. So increasingly, these ideas have featured quite a bit, say in discussions around Forest Rights Act, discussions around irrigation, including people like the World Bank pushing for participatory irrigation schemes in India. And they've borrowed quite extensively from the Ostromian ideas and many times as a way to validate it. And sometimes the genesis have emerged from the Ostrom, and these are powerful ideas, and these ideas need to be engaged with. We as we can see day in and day out, there's not a lot that the state can do. There's not a lot that the markets can do. In fact, markets tend to fail around these things. There's a lot of externalities. There's a lot of externalities across time as well, not just spatially. So we tend to overuse it now, and it might lead, which is what has happened in the climate change issue, right?
Right.
We've overused the carbon space, and there's a lot of dump that's there. But so we need to continue to engage with these ideas, but at the same time, keep an open mind towards the larger issues that are happening elsewhere.
So how does institutional economics and other and Ostrom and other thinkers, how do they think about time in this properly? Because so you need to have an enormous amount of social trust, whether in government or in the community or something, to say that, look, we will take a little bit of a hit today so that we don't have to take a bigger hit day after tomorrow or next year or 10 years from now.
Right.
Would you what's the thinking on that?
So, if you look at the problems per se, they are quite dynamic, right? And there are essentially moving targets, both on the societal side and on the environmental side. We're dealing with these two entities that are constantly changing and rapidly evolving.
Right.
And much more rapidly than what theorists and policymakers are, responding. The rate is quite different. And in some cases, some of the interventions themselves can become a problem at a time scale beyond that. So institutional economics, unfortunately, has taken a very static view of things. So although iteration is part of the process, there's a very ahistorical approach towards understanding this, which has been a major point of concern. But at the same time, I think people have found ways to resolve that. So the thinking that's driving today's approach towards intervening in these things is systems thinking, where you look at it holistically, where you try to intervene around these things, not by looking at its parts. So the traditional approach has been to look at a problem, decompose it, analyze the parts, and try to make sense of the whole.
Right.
But here, with complexity, the kind of challenges that we've had, we need to look at not just parts. So if you look at an ant and an ant colony, we can't think of the behavior of the ant colony by looking at an individual ant. There are other rules that are operating around it, right?
Right.
So now the focus is on looking at these interactions. The focus is on looking at and acknowledging, and the starting point is this acknowledgement that there are no definitive solutions. So each solution is sort of an iteration. So we don't need policies, but we need adaptive policies, apparently. So where we need to look at these interventions also as a work in progress, and we learn by doing in that sense, and then constantly pay attention to the process of implementation. And
so it's a constant sort of problem solving thinking,
right.
Rather than here is this mechanism and this system that
right.
You implement this well and everything else will get taken care of.
Right.
All right.
And
on that note, let's take a quick break and we'll come back. And I want to explore a little more on the idea of time in this, and maybe we'll also start talking a little more about the global commons and how we might want to think about climate change.
Okay.
नमस्ते, मैं हूँ सौरभ चंद्रा
और मैं प्रणय कुटस्थाने।
जब महफिल खत्म होते होते दरवाजे के बाहर पुलिया के ऊपर हम दुनिया भर की जटिल समस्याओं को सॉल्व करने में लग जाते हैं तो हो जाती है पुलियाबाजी।
अब आजकल के अपार्टमेंट वालों ने तो कभी पुलिया देखी नहीं होगी, पर आप फीलिंग तो समझ ही सकते हैं।
तो आइए शामिल हो जाइए हमारी पुलियाबाजी में, जहां प्रणय और मैं एक से एक इंटरेस्टिंग टॉपिक्स की तह तक जाएंगे।
आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस, बिटकॉइन, पाकिस्तान, मेडिकल एजुकेशन, करेंसी क्राइसिस, कभी हम दोनों के साथ और अक्सर स्पेशल एक्सपर्ट गेस्ट की कंपनी में।
सुनिए हमें IVM की वेबसाइट, ऐप या अपने फेवरेट पॉडकास्टिंग प्लेटफॉर्म पर हर दूसरे हफ्ते।
Hi and welcome back to the Pragati Podcast. I'm here with Lingaraj and we are talking about the commons and how they might have been characterized as a tragedy, and they're probably still a tragedy in most places, but they need not be one. Lingaraj, so going away from lakes and traffic and local problems, one of the big challenges that we are facing is also a commons challenge, which is climate change. And but before we talk about that, to me, the question even of climate change is, okay, you have to take some pain now because in terms of, reduced emissions, maybe the amount of energy you consume has to be lower or more efficient. You have to do all of those things now so that maybe your grandchildren or great-grandchildren won't suffer 100 years from now, right? And the idea is not that all the events will only happen 100 years later, but year on year, risks keep accumulating. And it is very well characterized as a wicked problem, right? It's not necessarily visible. There's a lot of noise along with the signal. The impact is not equal on everyone. If its impact is more on the poor, you can always say, okay, this is 2019. From 2020, I'll start acting. 2019, I want a free pass. And you can do that sort of salami slicing every year, right? So it's sort of the worst problem on any dimension. But my one thought was, what kind of institutions do we have that actually navigate that kind of a time scale? Because I'm looking at, say, Government of India and various institutions that we have set up, right? At best, I think we look at 5 years or 10 years in India. To me, say, fiscal responsibility is something where people look at something like a 5-year time scale. One government thinks of a 5-year term. We have a few things that go beyond that. Even the 5-year plans for 5-year plans, right? And sure, there might be a few things where there might be plans on paper for 15 years or for 20 years. I honestly don't know how much that matches with operational reality. So how do you think about this time question before we look at the overall climate change question?
I think you rightly said, you rightly termed it wicked problems. They are indeed wicked, and we're operating in this zone of mess, right? Essentially. And if you look at historically, one of the early people or early institutions to acknowledge the problem of climate change and start planning for it was the US Defense. So one of the earliest studies commissioned on climate change was by the US Army, and they start thinking strategically, and the report is pertinent even to this day.
And even before that, I think the US Army Corps of Engineers have a long history of river management, dam construction, and all of that, right?
Absolutely. But with respect to climate change, they start thinking strategically. They acknowledge that it's a security risk. They acknowledge that it is a humanitarian risk. All of that are current now, but not when they did it in the 60s, right? Much before the IPCC process and things like that. And even in India, I mean, people have been thinking about it long term, but there's only so much that we can do. Doing it's constrained by a lot of things. We, as a country, are dealing with a lot of immediate stresses and immediate pressures. To quote an example, I think in 2011, there was this project that we were doing in my earlier institution that was looking at the Gangetic Basin and looking at devising an adaptation plan of action. The time frame that study had was to respond to 2030s, 2050s, and 2080s. And this was a multi-institutional study, some 11 institutions worldwide, a lot of money, a lot of computational resources, all of that were pooled into it. And so the ultimate task was about coming out with this really short-term measures, medium-term, and long-term.
Right.
And part of it was also go to the field, meet with people, speak with them, try and understand what they were saying, and try to align some of that and all that. And I vividly remember this. It was in Uttarakhand, in one of those Terai districts. Udham Singh Nagar, I think, is the district name. So I don't know if you know, but Terai is where most of these rivers kind of hit the plains. They're swift. They're very young rivers. They're constantly changing their paths. And at the same time, there's a lot of afforestation, which is sort of compounding all of this. So just as we were leaving our consultation, you have this one farmer coming to us running, and all this while we've been speaking to them about 2030s and 2050s and 2080s, and this guy has a sheet of paper with him, and this is a mistake that everybody makes. People tend to think of us as this government servants, right? And he thought, okay, I came late and I was doing labor somewhere and etc. So what has happened is this Ramganga river had cut across his field and it's washed literally. There's just some 1/3 of it is still intact, and he doesn't have a farm essentially. And to make things worse, his paperwork isn't right. It's in some ancestor's name, and there's so many other intricate problems associated with just the land title.
Like most land titles in India.
Absolutely. And then that's when I became really disturbed in the sense that all of these resources, all of this money, all of this manpower, brain, computation, etc., is directed at a time frame that's not relevant to him. That's not relevant to the community that we hope to help cope with the impacts of climate change. But not all challenges are like that. For climate change mitigation, to think of reducing emissions, we need to have that kind of a time, because the carbon dioxide that we are dealing with today is the carbon dioxide that was emitted in the 1700s, 1800s. Right. We're dealing with historical carbon. We're carrying it with us wherever we go, and that's accumulating, right? Right. So there's a need for us to also, factor this long time frame considerations in our current development trajectory. And despite all challenges, there are certain things that we can do, and most countries are doing. They're investing in renewables, they're focusing on energy efficiency, electric vehicle, clean energy, etc. So there's a lot that they're doing. At the same time, there's still fundamentally we're still following the same developmental trajectory. Okay. Be it how our cities are growing, be it how we are conceptualizing resources within our urban policies or our consumption patterns. None of these have changed in any meaningful or a significant way since the Kyoto discussions or Copenhagen or any of these COPs. None of it has changed. And at the same time, since you spoke about doing, right, for institutions to think long term, there are uncertainties. There are uncertainties in what the models say. There are uncertainties in around policies and how people act, etc. And
we cannot necessarily predict what happens in the future, right? In the sense of, for example, when we talk about cities, most people say the kind of city design that a city adopts, the choices typically can affect for up to 150 years or more, right?
That's what they call, right? Legacy infrastructure. Right. These are long-term investments, infrastructure.
And unless, you have a world war or something where your city gets bombed and you get to rebuild that city from scratch, you have to live with that legacy. Right. I think a lot of European cities actually benefited in a perverse way from being bombed, and they had to build sort of from scratch in a way. Right. So you have that kind of a long-term impact of some of the actions that you take. But at the same time, we can't necessarily predict things, right? Now if we design infrastructure, say in a city like Bangalore, around, say, parking and roads and cars, and suddenly 50 years later, you have a very different way in which people are commuting. Very tough to account for that, right? For example, I know that in Delhi, this has become a big challenge. The Delhi Development Authority, which had built these colonies of houses in many places, right? And I think the assumption was you will have one scooter and something else, and now everyone has a car. Now, could you have anticipated that, and therefore did excessive land allocation, which might have been considered wasteful? Very tough to think through those questions, right? How much do you allocate? It might be inefficient now, but might be necessary 100 years from now. Right. So how do you? It's very hard once you add all the wickedness of the climate change problem to this as well, right?
And one of the core feature of a wicked problem is that there are no definitive solutions, and the problem formulation or definition might change depending on whom you ask. Right. So for the US, climate change is not an immediate concern. despite Sandy and despite the flooding that they see every now and then, it's
Right.
still not a major issue for them. But it's a reality for some of us here in India and Africa and elsewhere. So we need long-term thinking, definitely, and we also need to acknowledge that we can change certain things. There are still that things that are win-win around it. If you look at adaptation, there's a lot that we can do, starting from early warning systems,
Right.
having efficient housing codes, having simple things in place that work,
Right.
right? And governance, fixing, it might resolve a lot of things that they are the most cost-effective means to respond to these challenges. And even on the mitigation side, for a long time, India had this view that we can't speak of clean energy in a country that's so energy deficient. We still have to meet our developmental needs, and we have to do that in ways that help us. But
Right.
now, increasingly, we're feeling that we need to decarbonize because our coal reserves aren't that efficient. There's a lot of land conflicts around it. There's a lot of issues with pollution, urban inequality, all of that. I mean, all of that helps us to, even keeping climate change outside of this whole conversation, we still need to decarbonize. It helps. It's good for the environment. It's good for you. I mean, it's a developmental question at the end of it, and it's helping. I mean, although we're making some investments in terms of solar plants and energy efficiency and whatnot, there's still a lot that we can do, and hopefully we'll get there. But
Right.
globally, I think we need to keep this conversation going.
Right. So the global conversation, both informal and structured in the form of the COP process that happens every year, has been going on for a while, right? So coming back to sort of Gareth Hardin's classic formulation of tragedy of the commons and the classic solutions that he offers. When we're talking about climate change, one, there is no global government. Two, there is no market around this exactly, right? I mean, there's been talk of carbon credits for a while, but I mean, we still don't have necessarily a market mechanism to fully trade and sort of manage how much carbon emissions that we do at scale across the world, right? So how does institutional economics, Ostrom's thinking, critical economics, how do you approach this problem of climate change, and how should we be thinking about it?
So some of the formulations, such as, say, polycentric institutions, which came towards the end of Ostrom's career, was primarily aimed at responding to these kind of questions. So she said, no institution is huge enough to tackle all of this. We need institutions that work together. There are multiple things operating elsewhere, and
so could you give me an example of what a polycentric system might be?
So it's not a well-defined system, right? So polycentric essentially means that there are this diverse set of actors or institutions or agencies that are mediating social interaction. So if you take climate change, on one side we have these country groups that are negotiating. On one side, you have these businesses as part of country groups that are negotiating. On the other side, you have citizen network, NGOs, you have city groups, urban groups. All of them are trying to find a way to connect and respond to it. All of them are institutions in itself. Each coalition, each network is an institution in itself. And it's not, controlled by a single agent. It's not directed by a single agent, but they're all trying to resolve the same question at various levels. So there is something called ICLAI, which is a coalition of city, local institutions, and it's a global network. And they are trying to posit a climate resilient city approach to urbanization, right? And you have small island states forming a group, trying to devise their own response to it. And even if you strip all of these groups, there are interactions. So when you said market mechanisms, although it's not fully efficient, fully functional, but there's a lot of work that's already gone. Over the past 10, 12 years, we've had both RED++, and CDM. So RED is essentially reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. It's a market mechanism to prevent forest destruction in developing countries. So for instance, if if Brazil has found this huge oil reserve underneath the Amazon, traditional or conventional wisdom tells us that they can go and develop and perhaps, destruct that whole patch of Amazon. But given the kind of impact that it has globally, Amazon is a global carbon sink.
Right.
And I don't think no other ecosystem is that strong and that vital for the sustenance of our, not just climatic pattern, but even smaller things like precipitation locally.
Right.
And it plays a role in negotiating a lot of things,
Right.
and in driving a lot of things. So while Brazil has onus, right, in protecting it, but it also has to deal with its own challenges. So globally, they evolved a mechanism where they said, okay, you don't do it there. We will compensate you for that.
Okay.
Okay, there's a market mechanisms. So and the underlying basis for this is something called coast theorem, so in the absence of no rights, right, it's an open access. So I own a car, you own a bicycle. Both of us have 10 polluting rights. Okay, you own a bicycle, so you're not polluting at all.
Right.
I own a car and I pollute 80 units of my polluting rights.
Right.
So I can go to this 10 cyclists and I can buy 10 polluting units. I mean, to simplify course, this is how it operates. So in countries, say Germany, or in other countries where there's a lot of developmental activity, where there's a lot of emissions, you can actually pay for reducing emissions and reducing deforestation.
So it's like you've set up an exchange,
right?
So the people who might need to pollute more need to buy credits of some sort.
It's linked to carbon credits,
right? And people who are not polluting as much get paid money or get compensated for not doing.
So in Europe, typically even conferences, they'll buy rights. They want to be carbon neutral, and these things have become so important and mainstream that it's pretty cool to be saying that for them. It's part of their marketing and things like that. But again, these have its own limitations. I mean, these can't operate as efficiently as they should, because there's a lot of transaction cost. How do we monitor? What's the scale at which it's appropriate? Even in India, we've had few RED and RED Plus projects, but with very varying degrees of success.
Right. And if under that sort of a schema, the point of a forest is to capture carbon, then you'd grow trees that grow very, very quickly.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
As opposed to maintain a high diversity, maintain sort of ecological balance, water table, etc. Right. You just want that tree to grow quickly, capture as much carbon as you can.
You're right. I mean, that's what is happening in Latin America. There's a lot of plantation forests, even in India to some extent, but in Latin America it's more visible, and there's no way that you can replace
virgin Amazon jungle with some palm plantation, right?
So there's a lot of plantation projects which are being projected as RED projects. So all of that is part of it. So there's a lot of costs that are incurred to monitor and evaluate these projects. So all of it adds to the inefficiency of the system, and then system wouldn't sustain after a point, which is why it's had very limited success. But my limited point being, we need all of it. We need to learn from all of it, and we need to constantly, evolve and innovate. There's no way that we can escape these things. There are these inefficiencies, but we still need to engage with it.
Right.
And that's the only way to keep abreast with the changing nature of the problem itself.
Right. And I guess within a country like India, we have to do the obvious things that will help us anyway, but might also help with climate change, right? Like, it's obvious that every large city needs a vibrant public transport that caters to a majority of the population. Right. And if you do that, yes, emissions of that city will come down. Right. So I think those are the win-wins that you were mentioning earlier, right? I mean, there's some obvious things that we just have to do.
And I think that's what we've always done also, especially when you're going into the negotiations, climate change negotiations. India showcased a lot of things as things that have helped with climate change, that they are doing as part of their commitments. Even from an adaptation point of view, they sort of packaged NREGA as the largest climate adaptation initiative anywhere in the world. It was a smart thing to do. I mean, to do that, to gain traction in conversations. And there's something called Green India Mission, which was originally part of the National Action Plan, and now it's intricately, I mean, connected with social forestry schemes and even things like compensatory afforestation schemes. So government is conveniently showing that as part of its greening mission, as part of it decarbonization. It's showing a lot of solar. It has had ambitious targets, and we've done really well there. And it's showcasing all of that as part of it. It might not have necessarily come as part of climate change thinking, but it necessarily, clearly it has helped us. It has helped us also make the case for India's position in the global arena.
So, Lingaraj, going back to the micro, any other sort of examples that you can share from across the world where you've seen sort of ashram or whatever other ideas put into action and people are managing to sort of govern their commons reasonably well?
Right. One of the really good success that we've seen is from Canada. So Canadian First Nation states, which are essentially the native dwellers of North America, the Aboriginal groups, they have been successful in ensuring that they have limited, in negotiating with the government and with the state to leave their own resources, be it fishing grounds, mostly with fishing rights, and they've done remarkably well. They've had limited self-governance for a long time now. And government is just an external player, is one of the agents that's helping them do that.
Okay.
And
you have these traditional communities which sort of are caretakers of large parcels of land or bodies of water?
Both.
Okay.
Both. And these institutions are not necessarily devised to deal with water resources or land. They deal with every aspect of governance of those regions.
Right.
So, and because of how closely their lives and livelihoods are tied with these resources, there's a lot of onus on managing these patches of forests and water. And they've very elaborate network of regulations governing their action, fairly well thought out things. And one of the oft criticized aspects of community action is that they don't have this foresight, they don't have this long-term thinking, or even they don't really recognize, say, translocal impacts. So they are so rooted in their region that they can only think, but that's not really the case. They understand so if there is a river, we've seen these Native American groups investing time and efforts and resources in looking at the sources of those rivers, in afforestation drives in those sources of rivers, so they can think beyond the limited boundaries of their terrain. Wow. And I think it works well because, one, it's a small community and the nation itself is going through a different developmental trajectory. They can afford these sort of governance luxury, so as to say.
Right.
And relatively homogeneous group. And there's a lot of other enabling conditions, such as good governance exist as a norm, right? And the equation with the government and with the community itself is not so fraught.
Right.
So in India, our engagement with even the simplest of things with the system is fraught with so many inefficiencies, so many other bottlenecks. So we have an instinctive whining equation or tone that we take with the government, with anything to do with government machinery.
Right.
And those things have a way of, popping up everywhere. That attitude, that sort of an approach towards formal institutions, they don't have that baggage, and that's helped navigate some of these tensions fairly effectively. And
so they've managed to avoid overfishing and other problems in their areas.
And at least for now, they have very stable arrangements, and they hope to do that. They hope to keep these things sacred and thriving for a while. And I think it also helps that they're getting incentivized by the state and by the markets. So even the companies pay a premium
Okay.
in this fish that's harvested ethically. So you have a certification mechanism that comes in. So once you have something that's working, market finds its way, and it finds way to tap into all of this and find ways to monetize some of it, and it's benefiting both the community and the system.
Lingaraj, like you said, in Canada, you have all these sort of preconditions that allow for this kind of work to happen, right? You have by and large a good government in place that's responsive, that's efficient, that takes inputs, all of that. So now if we come back to India and you come back to these wretched lakes of Bangalore or anywhere else, how should we be thinking, and what do you think are sort of some of the precursors that you need for good governance of the commons?
I think, as we discussed earlier, first of all, it's important to find our connections back and find our, we've gone past the agrarian way of life, but still they represent something, and it's about finding those meaning, and we have to evolve these things actively, not just with within ourselves, but with also with our younger generation and things like that. If you look at the lakes in Bangalore, it's important to remember that these are products of human activity and ingenuity. They are human artifacts. They're not natural in a very natural sense of the term. All of it. And you have this seasonal water channel. Some of it has been dammed and they've been converted into a lake. And each of these cascade into a lake further down. And it's done with a lot of thought, a lot of foresight, a lot of engineering skills of a certain time.
Right.
And people recognize the value of it, so much so that you have inscriptions starting from 900s to as late as 1800 that document these things, right? And among the many things that these inscriptions talk is this notion of conserving this place. One, it's memorialized all the people that have either contributed in small ways or contributed in big way, that have helped in dredging it or building a spillway, whatever. But at the same time, there are this really good ones where you have this set of shapas, set of sanctions and curses that you would incur if you would pollute it or if you would do something with this lake. So that's how.
Which is something that resonated with that era of the users. Right.
I think for now we need to bring these memories back. We need to find newer ways of engaging with these memories. I mean, people might not necessarily attach themselves like that, but at the same time, it's a useful starting point to evolve associations and networks that would help in conserving these things in the local level. And even these citizens groups, civic groups, they can act as these interfaces between government and markets, and they can ensure that all the regulations are met. So they can fill in for a lot of voids that that's the state would leave. So at the same time, we need to understand that we can forge these things through thinking, planning, etc. But some of these things also operate in a very autonomous self sort of way. And if I have to look at it from a state's perspective, the state should ideally plan their interventions around pre-existing networks such as these, where they should, in some limited form, it's already happening, where the implementation is always carried out in association with some local NGO or whatnot. But even outside of these whole organized NGOs, there is some value and utility in tapping into citizen networks, walkers association, and that ways you can evolve a culture that's more sensitive. And
so in a way, it's sort of, you're saying it's going beyond just conventional ways in which people say, we'll do participatory governance, but to actually see what are the local norms that are developed around some of these commons, see which ones of them make sense, and then sort of give them the sanction of law and other things, which ties very nicely back to the Swiss example that you gave, right? The community sort of came up with this arrangement, got codified into law, and people are by and large happy. Right. So maybe that is the system. Look at the norms that are developing from society that are helpful, and then sort of give them some more strength and impetus.
Right. For now, at least, I mean, the way participation or self-governance or local self-government, all of these they've become a checklist in a whole set of things, right?
Right.
So there's social audit. It's embedded as part of EIA process. You have to go and have these consultations. But what would happen in these consultations is something that we should ponder. For instance, Bangalore had this master plan, and the draft was up for consultation, and the draft was only in English. So how do you ensure that vast chunk of people participate in the process? Is by doing these smaller things efficiently and creating forums that are efficient. So there's a lot of possibilities that are there on that front to do it. And another thing that I wanted to kind of allude was participation. Again, it can happen at so many levels other than just having one member from the community in some committee, right? Participation, even engaging with that space and doing something with the space is participatory.
Yeah, if you're jogging around a newly built, jog track around a lake, you're participating, right? So,
and it aligns with a lot of other goals that the state has with Panchayat, 73rd Amendment, and with the ward committees. And
I think those are constitutional goals. I don't know if they're really governmental goals for most of our governments, but that's true.
But they align with it. I mean, if we are smart, we can tap into all of these institutional mechanisms that are already in place. We don't need to create anything new. Right. And one way of evolving interventions that are helpful is by looking at this mechanism that already exists and aligning your intervention to, with these pre-existing mechanisms. And that would ensure a lot of things with very little transaction costs.
Okay.
And
that's a interesting note, right? I mean, we don't often think of transaction costs that way, but in a sense, it's the friction that's needed to take various kinds of actions or do various kinds of things, right? And I guess the friction is always very, very high when you want a large number of people to come together and agree on something or do something together. And so tapping into these networks, making norms into laws, all these various things are ways in which you can keep that friction minimal, but again, conserve and protect the commons.
Right.
So Lingaraj, thank you so much for coming on the Pragati Podcast. It was an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I've been a fan of this podcast, and I really enjoyed participating in this. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for staying with us till the end. If you have any questions or comments, do write in to podcast@thinkpragati.com. And hey, if you like the podcast and listen to us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. It'll mean a lot to us. The Pragati Podcast is available on the IVM Podcast app and pretty much every other podcast app and platform. We are there everywhere.
India's a massive subcontinent, home to truly stunning diversity. Behind the veils of smoke that obscure our thriving cities, our history is still alive, glimmering like sequins, waiting to be discovered. And if you, like me, are straining to hear the echoes of our past, this podcast is for you. I'm Anirudh Kanisetti, a history and geopolitics researcher, and I host Echoes of India, a history podcast about India, by Indians, and for Indians. In Echoes, we journey through the complex histories of South Asia and what they can teach us about our globalized world. Tune in every Wednesday on ivmpodcast.com or your favorite podcast app.
Filter coffee is a fascinating beverage. You need to pick the right beans, blend them in the right proportion, roast them to perfection, and slow brew at the right temperature to get the perfect cup. Which is exactly like great conversations as well. You need to track down the most interesting minds, get them into their zone, and settle down for an unhurried, unscripted chat. And coffee for me is always, always, always best enjoyed with friends. I'm Karthik Nagarajan, and do share my table as I meet some of the most interesting people I know and sit them down for a strong cup of coffee and an even stronger conversation. Join me every Wednesday for a freshly brewed episode. This is not frappe. This is the Filter Coffee Podcast.